Meeting to order. Tonight, we're here for a discussion on solar farms in Newberry County, trying to gather some facts and information. And first, we call Mr. Rick Farmer, Economic Development Director, to the podium for discussion of solar farms in Newberry County.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of council. I won't be giving the discussion here, but we did bring in some speakers for you here today that hopefully will shed some light on this issue. At your July meeting, you guys were faced with a contentious rezoning matter, and you had people on both sides giving conflicting information about solar and the entire concept. So when the subject of a workshop came up, the interim administrator and myself coordinated, and we knew that this had to be a fact-based, neutral type of presentation. So I set about gathering some materials for you that have been provided, and I tried to gather those from neutral organizations that did not have a vested interest in solar energy. And so you have the benefit of those documents on there. We also wanted to find a couple of speakers who might be able to shed some light on these things tonight. And so I first started with the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. I made contact with an old colleague there who then sent me to the South Carolina Energy Office, which is in the Governor's Office of Regulatory Staff. That brought me one of our two speakers. Then I also went to the University of South Carolina. Thinking that I could find, they have a renewables office, maybe I could find a professor, an adjunct professor, or somebody like that who could speak to council this evening. That didn't pan out. I did find a professor, and he sent me to Mike Smith, who is one of our speakers tonight, and I'll introduce him later. But we've assembled for you a couple of speakers with a couple of good presentations for you to gather some good factual information on this so you can take the best, most informed decision when that time comes. So with that, I'd like to just go ahead and introduce your first speaker tonight. Well, first, let me tell you who I have here. I have Stacy Washington. She is with the Office of Regulatory Staff, the South Carolina Energy Office, and Mike Smith. Mike Smith is a PhD candidate at the University of South Carolina's engineering programs. He's also an employee of the organization, the South Carolina Electric Cooperatives. So let me introduce Stacy, and she'll begin with her presentation. Stacy Washington holds a BS degree in chemical engineering from North Carolina A&T State University. She has 2 years of process engineering experience and over 20 years of industrial and state government environmental sustainability experience. She currently works as a senior energy specialist in the SCORS Energy Office, providing technical assistance and working with outreach, data, loan programs, incentives and rebates, and energy planning. Stacy's also worked at the SCDHEC in the recycling office and previously issued air permits in DHEC's Bureau of Air Quality, as well as providing pollution prevention technical assistance to businesses in the DHEC Center for Environmental Sustainability. Stacy holds a BS degree in chemical engineering from NC A&T State University. She's also a certified South Carolina recycling professional and received the DHEC Technical Non-Management Employee of the Year Award in 2009. In April 2016, she received the Accredited Commercial Energy Manager certification. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Stacy Washington.
Thank you. As Rick said, my name is Stacy Washington, and I'm with the South Carolina Energy Office. Do I have a clicker?
I'm sorry, you will in a couple of minutes. This one doesn't work. For now, just tell her.
Okay, next slide.
I have a backup clicker.
So I just wanted to start off letting you know about the Energy Office and what we do. While she's going to the next slide, so we are, as said, in the Office of Regulatory Staff. We also are funded fully by the Department of Energy State Energy Programs, who are a fully funded U.S. Department of Energy program. Every state in the United States and all territories have an energy office, and we are one of those. Our mission is to promote energy efficiency, renewable energy, and clean transportation. And we do this through a variety of methods, including technical assistance, financial assistance, education and outreach, and maintaining our data clearinghouse, and also implementing the state energy plan. And today, the education and outreach portion is what I'm here for. Next slide. Since we're talking about solar, I wanted to introduce you all to our solar website, solar.sc.gov. That's a good place to go for information on solar. It's mostly consumer focused, but we do have a lot of information there just in general about solar and what you need to know, just the basics. Next slide. So today, Rick said you always want to know how solar works, so I wanted to start off with a diagram of that process. This is basically a combination of the photovoltaic effect and the photoelectric effect. Through the photoelectric effect, when light hits the panel, electron is generated. It comes into contact with a positively charged semiconductor that then starts the photovoltaic effect, which you get the PV from photovoltaic solar panel. A voltage is created that then goes to the circuit, and then a load is created, and that's your electricity that you get from each solar cell. So these solar panels are composed of many of these solar cells that have all this happen and generate this load. Next slide. Also want to just discuss briefly solar panel materials. I know you all had a discussion about those materials. I listed silicon here as a main material. I know cadmium telluride is another material that you all have been discussing. Silicon is the most prominent material that's used in solar panels. The cadmium telluride is also used in thin film solar. So I just wanted to give you, I put silicon there because it's the most used, but cadmium telluride is also used. And then I just have listed there different other parts of the solar panel, the metal frame, glass casing, wire, plexiglass insulation, and a protective back sheet. So addressing the silicon and cadmium telluride, when they are in the solar panel and they're being used for their purpose of generating electricity in that solar farm, there's no harm to the environment from them being installed there in the farm. The problem is when the farm is then no longer being used and you want to dispose of the panels, then that becomes an issue because is it a hazardous waste? How do you dispose of it? Do you recycle it? So right now there's a lot of studying being done on what to do with end-of-life solar panels, whether it's recycling or treating it as hazardous waste. In a little bit in the presentation, I'll let you know what DHEC is doing to address that. Next slide. So then I wanted to talk about another component of a solar farm is an inverter. I don't know if you all talked about that here, but there's a picture there of an inverter. Inverters just convert the direct current that is generated from the solar panels to alternating current. That's another component of the solar farm that is important because AC, or alternating current, is what you use in your home. So you need that there to convert that electricity. And then this basic electronic components that are in that inverter. So just wanted to make sure you're aware that there's another component. Next slide. So solar farm, thank you. Pros and cons. Pros, that can diversify your revenue in the county and give you another economic income stream. Clean energy with a solar farm, unlike other fossil fuels like coal and natural gas, you don't have those emissions coming from the farm. They are quiet, low maintenance. You know, you can mow around them and then, just the general maintenance of anything like you have that's electronic. And then workforce development. You can generate jobs in the county by employing people to install solar farms. Cons, there's a high initial cost. As with any project, there's going to be a large upfront cost. A large space is needed compared to other utility projects for the space that you are using to develop a solar farm. In that same acreage or square footage, you could generate more electricity. Generation depends on weather. So if it's cloudy, rainy, snowing, that can decrease the efficiency of the solar panels. And then end-of-life considerations, like we discussed earlier with the silicon and the cadmium telluride, what do you do with these panels at the end of life? Next slide. So I just wanted to present you all with some solar data for the state. Oh, I forgot. So looking at the solar installations in South Carolina, since 2014, we have done, really increased those solar installations. I call it, and I'll talk about this later, the Act 236 effect, which was some legislation that was passed in 2014 that kind of helped start or ignite the fire in solar in the state. So now we're up to 25,550 solar installations as of July 31st of last year.
Now, this is residential and commercial installations?
Residential, commercial, industrial, utility scale, everything. So this just gives you an idea of by county, the solar installations. So I circled Newberry County on there so you can just see where you all are in comparison to the rest of the state. I just wanted to give you an idea of how you compare. So in South Carolina, oh, there's not the number there, but the residential is the blue pie there. You can see that most of the installations are residential installations, and then we have a little pie for industrial and utility scale. But these are just the number of installations. If we look at the solar capacity, which is like the size of installation, utility scale is the most, followed by residential, and then industrial. So this is actual size, capacity. And then looking at Newberry County, I'm sorry the numbers aren't showing up, they were in the presentation, but in Newberry County, you do have mostly residential solar installations and then one industrial, which is the Newberry Electric Cooperative Community Solar Project, solar farm. And then we have by capacity, since it's mostly residential, the residential capacity is higher, and then you have that 250 kilowatt Newberry Electric Cooperative Solar. So now I want to go to legislation. You know, how did we get here? What is this Act 236 that I was talking about? In Act 236 that was passed in June 2014, there was a lot of information and legislation passed to help start growth of solar in South Carolina. Parts of that legislation included renewable generation leasing. So this is, the Office of Regulatory Staff established a leasing program for third-party leasing companies to be able to have leasing and companies to approach homeowners so they can, or businesses so they can lease solar in South Carolina. Net metering was also established. There were new rates for net metering. Do you all know what net metering is? Okay. No, some people said no. So basically net metering is like you have your house or a business, you have solar on it or ground mounted. You generate that solar, whatever solar you use will go to your home, but any solar that is in excess, if you don't need it, if it's at night, not at night, but if it's during the day and you generate electricity and that you're using that in your house, anything excess will go back on the grid. And whatever you get back from that, you'll get back money from the utility from that. And so right now, or not right now, but there was one-to-one net metering that was available. So basically what you would have gotten was spent for electricity, you would have gotten that back on your bill. But there's new legislation I'll talk about in another act that was passed that stopped that.
Yeah, it's no longer one-to-one.
It's no longer one-to-one. That's correct. So and then also distributed energy resource programs were established. In that net metering legislation, the utilities, I want to say also that this is for investor-owned utilities as well. So this is only for Duke Energy Progress, Duke Energy Carolinas, and Dominion Energy South Carolina. Before it was SCE&G. So with that net metering, they were also supposed to have a 2%, have enough solar that would cover 2% of the previous 5-year average of their retail peak demand. In order to meet this goal or target, each utility set up a program to reach that goal. So that happened in this legislation as well. And then interconnection standards were developed to cover generation up to 80 megawatts. So some of these larger solar installations were covered with this new interconnection standards, or updated interconnection standards. So next we had Act 62 that was passed in 2019. And this is what Mr. Shealy here was saying. Now there's no more one-to-one net metering. So there's different components to this legislation as well. Consumer protection regulations is one, where we noticed that when we had Act 236 come along, a lot of bad actors came in, people were getting scammed, and so we're looking at things to address that. So regulations have been established by the Office of Regulatory Staff and Consumer Affairs, Department of Consumer Affairs of South Carolina, to help with consumer protection issues. So if there's any bad actors out there, they can be fined. If any bad actors can be fined, there's also disclosures that are included in the solar contracts, and then there will be a brochure that will go out that every solar installer will be required to hand out that will explain solar in South Carolina, what the incentives are, what a tax credit is, those types of things, because people were confused and thinking they could get a tax credit when they couldn't, and were saying they could get a certain amount of generation when they couldn't. So this is supposed to help explain that information. Also, a solar choice metering tariffs were established, and that's what we were talking about, but there's no more one-to-one net metering. So this is, again, just for investor-owned utilities, Duke Energy Carolinas, Duke Energy Progress, and Dominion Energy South Carolina. They, all of these actions had dockets that were put before the Public Service Commission. They reviewed all of those, and now there are new tariffs out there for net metering for those utilities. Neighborhood community solar was also in that act, and dockets have been opened at the Public Service Commission for community solar as well, and that's still in process. Voluntary renewable energy programs were also a part of that, so a lot of businesses, like some of the large businesses you all have in Newberry County, wanted to get into solar and wanted to hit some of their targets for sustainability, but did not have a good way of doing that with the current way the regulations were set up. So now that those investor-owned utilities have voluntary renewable energy programs that can help those companies meet those targets. Also, small power producers and utilities generation, resource procurement, which is basically competitive procurement and avoid costs. That kind of is active right now. It's a docket that's open at the Public Service Commission, and that can also affect solar farms and what's happening here. The cost or whatever they decide in that docket can affect what the power purchase agreement looks like for solar farms. Integrated resource plans were also part of that Act 62, and this also involves all of the electric utilities, not just IOUs. Everyone has to submit, well, the IOUs have to submit IRP, or Integrated Resource Plan, to the Public Service Commission. This also stated that Santee Cooper submitted theirs to the Energy Office, and it added the cooperatives and the municipal electric utilities submitting their Integrated Resource Plans to the Energy Office. It also added different things to help the IRPs address demand-side management, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and storage. Some of the new things that are coming along to make sure that they are considered when the utilities are planning for the next 15 years. Interconnection standards is coming up again, and docket is open at the Public Service Commission, and then also this act stated that the Public Service Commission could do an integration study. So all of these have had dockets that are open at the Public Service Commission. So last, I want to talk about solar and the environment. So as I mentioned earlier, we were talking about the environment and the silicon and the cadmium telluride that are in the solar panels, what happens when at the end of life of a solar panel. So in this last year of the General Assembly, a proviso was put in place for DHEC to look at this issue and put a study committee together so they could figure out, and regulations for what to do at the end of life of these panels when these solar farms are no longer going to be generating. So the proviso said that DHEC should submit regulations within 120 days. So July, I believe 1 was the date, so I said by November, that would be when regulations would need to be established. This is for PV, for photovoltaic, solar, and storage end-of-life management for projects that will be decommissioned that are greater than 13 acres. So those large projects. And then stakeholder group is currently meeting, as I said. And so the regulations shall address hazardous waste issues, end-of-life management methods, the volume of the issue in South Carolina, the financial assurance, infrastructure needs, and needs beyond utility scale. So they're trying to look at all of the different issues there and just look at what they will need to do at the end of life. Also, I wanted to address DNR has a habitat program that I wanted to make sure you all knew about for solar farms, for pollinators. So one of the issues with solar farms, not issue, but one of the things with solar farms is making sure the grass stays cut and that you don't have the overgrowth that will diminish the efficiency of the solar panels. One of the ways to do this is with a pollinator habitat. Not only is it good for the soil and the environment, it also will decrease operation and maintenance needs because you can put some of the lower growing pollinators in the solar farm. So this act was enacted in 2018, and there's a voluntary certification program that you can apply for through the Clemson Extension. So it would be at the very beginning stages, like you are now of a solar farm. You'll really need to get in the beginning to make sure that you get the land done properly and get the right plants put out there because it takes a while for them to grow. Like I said, it helps farm end of life. It's good for the soil and the surrounding environment, bringing in those pollinators, and reduces solar farm maintenance. And then last, I just wanted to talk about trees and solar farms. So I know that this solar farm is pending will be on a timber farm. So I asked the Department of Natural Resources to give me some information on that. So this is not my expertise here. I'm just telling you what the Department of Natural Resources has told me. They said that if you cut down trees for solar farms, that it will cause habitat fragmentation and conversion, and that's a problem for wildlife. There is an order of operation for solar site preference, which is on top of an existing human development or on low production or idle agricultural fields. And then as a last resort, you would clear forested land. So pine plantations provide more wildlife habitat value than a solar site. They wanted me to mention that, and that forested land helps with water quality protection. So that's the value of that land having the trees on there. And that concludes my presentation.
All right, Stacy, thank you for your presentation. Do any members of council have any questions for Stacy?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Reader?
I'm probably going to ask the same question to both people. I know in the news recently we talk a lot about global warming and climate control. What benefits would a solar farm have as far as global warming and climate control?
Right, so there's no emissions coming off of the solar farm. So some of the problem with the global warming or climate change issues are that utilities have, like the fossil fuel burning utilities have emissions from burning coal and natural gas. So that's not happening here because you're generating it from the sun. It's renewable energy.
Other questions for Stacy?
Just one question, Stacy. You mentioned some of the materials that could become hazardous materials at end of life whenever you're decommissioning and removing those. Those materials you mentioned, though, are not normally leachable, are they? I mean, these are not fluids, liquids that could leak out into the soil. These would only become hazardous at end-of-life decommissioning, much like handling asbestos.
Right, yeah, and even, as it's in that solar panel, as long as the solar panel is intact, what you're worrying about is what you do with that solar panel when you take it off that land. What's gonna happen to it? You don't want it to go into a landfill. You don't, are you gonna recycle it? Are you gonna put it in a hazardous waste disposal facility? What are you gonna do with it then? When it's there at the farm and intact, there's not an issue.
What is gonna be that protocol?
Well, that's what DHEC is looking at now with their stakeholder group, is what regulations are they gonna put in place for end of life.
And I do understand that there's, I guess, the closest recycle centers in North Carolina, I believe.
I
for
do
solar
not
panel
know where the
recycling.
closest one is. I'm not
I believe
familiar.
it's in North Carolina.
And I have looked up before, but people have called the office and asked what to do. And I've contacted electronics recyclers, and they'll say they'll take it for electronics recycling, but for a price. So I think, that type of recycling would be what it would be, but it would be expensive.
What's the life expectancy of the panels? Do you know that?
About 30 or 35 years.
What's the life of the solar farm itself?
Yeah, the same 30 or 35 years. You can use,
Okay,
the power purchase agreements are usually about 20 years, but you can still have life on that farm after that agreement.
so when they clear away the trees, said the habitation may affect the wildlife?
Yes. Yes, you can have, you know, you're cutting down their home, so, you know, that can kind of disturb their habitat.
So it might affect all the wildlife, or if I raise cows nests, will it have effect on them?
Well, we have had people that have, you can raise solar panels up and have cows graze, you know, on a solar farm. We've seen that in other parts of the country. I don't know of any here, but I've seen that. We have had solar farms that have sheep that graze on them, and they're used to keep the grass low. So, you know, there's, you know, people have used raised solar panels and had crops underneath them. So there's many, you know, just because you put solar panels on a site does not mean that you can't have cows graze or sheep graze or have some type of crops grow under there.
But the forestry impact is no different than clear cutting a spot of land, for pine.
Correct.
Same thing.
So it's not a waste hazard issue.
So,
It's not a hazard destroying those panels.
no. Well, it had to destroying the panels?
Yes, when the 30 years is up, to destroy, to take them down and leave them there would have the effect on the land.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't leave the panels there. So that's the whole point of the DHEC regulations, so they can have regulations out there to make sure that at the end of life, the panels are disposed of properly or handled properly. And you can, you know, in the power purchase agreements or even your zoning or your ordinances for the county, you can stipulate that, you know, use a certain type of panel or dispose of it this way, or, you know, there are different things that there's county ordinances out there that you can establish for solar, that you can, if you have specific things you want to make sure happen, you can stipulate that in
You
your
need a
ordinance.
decommissioning plan.
Decommission.
Yes.
And we have examples of some other counties decommissioning their regulations or requirements.
What are the odds of contamination of a site? I know it's probably kind of an unfair question, but
Very low.
Yeah, I don't have the data on that. I think, and that's mostly because solar, it is a new, you know, thing. You know, we haven't had many farms that have been out there for 20 or 30 years, so we don't have a lot that have been through that time period. So we don't have a lot of data on that. But I'm not aware of any in South Carolina that have had any issues in the time that I've been doing this.
Have you heard anything about like hail or anything damaging the panels? Does it generally?
They're
Yeah.
rated for hail, I mean, up to a certain speed. You know, you can go on YouTube and see videos of hail or testing of hail damage and see that it doesn't break the panel up to certain, I can't remember the speed, but they do test them for that. And we do have guidance on our website for what to do in a storm. So if, say there's a big storm coming, you want to make sure that everything is, you know, taken care of. There's best practices out there for solar farms to make sure that, one, that when you establish a solar farm, that you're putting it in there thinking about possible storm risk, and then two, for best practices when a storm is coming.
all right, other questions?
Have you had the opportunity to study like other countries? Because I know a lot of other countries are far ahead of what we are as far as solar panel uses.
Not me personally, but the U.S. Department of Energy, they have been studying this so much. They're also studying the recycling and all of that too. So I think on the U.S. scale, yes, they have been.
All right, any other questions?
So this proviso is due November.
Well, I just based off the dates in there. I know Mike is on that committee. I don't know if he knows anymore. I'm not on the actual stakeholder group. But according to the proviso, they have 120 days to establish regulations. And I don't know if that's changed or, I know a report's also due in 2022, I believe so. They're working on all of that.
All right, anything else, Stacy? Stacy, thank you for your time. Thank you for your information. Thanks for your expertise.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
And I just also want to say thank you to Stacy for being there. And thank you to the South Carolina Energy Office for having this resource, because we're all dealing with new technology here. And we have to educate ourselves along the way and figure out the best things to do. Our next speaker is Mike Smith. Mike serves as the Vice President of Business and Technology Strategy for the Electric Cooperatives of South Carolina, the state association of 18 independent member-owned electric utilities in the state. Mike works with state and national partners to develop understanding of how technology is changing the utility industry. A registered professional engineer in South Carolina, Mike's work includes contributions to the development of the Distributed Energy Resource Program Act, Act 236, adopted in 2014. The legislation was a compromise across multiple interests and organizations that opened the way for more distributed energy production in South Carolina. He contributed to another inclusive effort to develop the South Carolina State Energy Plan. Prior to becoming the Co-ops Association, Mike worked for 11 years at Central Electric Power Cooperative, the generation and transmission cooperative that acts as the power aggregator for South Carolina's cooperatives. Mike holds several advisory and board positions, including the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association's Distributed Energy Advanced Power Systems and the University of South Carolina's Grid Connected Advanced Power Electronics Systems. He sits on the South Carolina Solar Council and is on the executive committee of the Southeastern Energy Efficiency Alliance. Mike is a member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers and the National Society of Professional Engineers. Mike is a graduate of Clemson University with a BS in Electrical Engineering and Georgia Institute of Technology. He's an electrical engineering doctoral candidate at the University of South Carolina. Mike served 4 years in the U.S. Army as an officer in the Signal Corps. Mike?
Good evening. So I'm taking a really high view, and so, please don't be insulted if this is too high a view, but, ask questions as you see fit. I just want to give you a feel for solar in the state. And so, as Stacy mentioned, it's fairly recent. In 2008, we had 1/3 of a gigawatt of solar installed in all of the U.S. Just earlier this year, we passed 100 gigawatts of installed solar. And what does that equate to? That equates to 820 square miles of solar panels. That's a lot of solar panels. And you see on the site there, when this was built, Solar Star 1 and Solar Star 2, it's 580 megawatts. It's about 5 square miles. It's the largest solar installation in the U.S. when it was put in, and I think it still is. So I'm going to step back and I'm going to explain, because I said a gigawatt, and I'm not sure, you guys might not know what a gigawatt is. Well, it's 1,000 megawatts. Well, what's a megawatt? Well, a megawatt is 1,000,000 kilowatts. Well, okay, and a kilowatt's just your space heater running on medium. That's it. That's a kilowatt. And so there's a difference too between kilowatt and kilowatt hours. Sometimes you hear people saying it's producing so many kilowatt hours, or it's a 3 kilowatt site or a 3 megawatt site. Well, kilowatt, megawatt, and gigawatt is just power, and it's instantaneous power at this moment. And I say a good example of power would be if you pull too much power from that circuit right there, it throws a breaker. If you put too much load on it. But if you plug the load in over time, you can get the same energy out of it if you don't put it all in at the same time. Whereas energy is power over time. And a common term you hear is kilowatt hour, and that's typically what people get on their electric bill, is you pay 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's a common cost for electric. And so in my space heater example, in our 1 kilowatt space heater, if you run it for an hour, it uses 1 kilowatt hour. If you run it for 30 minutes, it uses 0.5 kilowatt hour. If you run it all day long, 24 kilowatt hours at 50 cents a kilowatt hour, you will pay $3.60 to run that space heater. Is that from the drive?
No, she's running the PDF.
Oh, can you run it?
I apologize.
I don't have enough connections in there to run it all. Yeah, that's good. And then use the one that says, I can't read it. Just grab one of the PowerPoint presentations.
It
The one
might-
that says-
You might,
The one that
Over
says
there,
two.
can see
you might
better.
be easy to read one right behind you.
Yeah, the second one from the
Second
top.
one. Second choice.
Yeah, double click that one and see how that goes. And then F5. All right, and so this is a question that was asked earlier. How long does a solar farm last? You know, conservatively, it's 25 to 30 years, 30 to 35 years is how long the solar panels, is the expected life of the solar panels. To date, as you saw in 2008, we didn't have many solar farms, so it hasn't even been 15 years since we really started putting these in. So the plants that were put in, 15 years ago still have another 15 years to go. So very few have been decommissioned, though people are planning to decommission them. There's a couple ways if a utility gets a solar farm. They can use a purchase power agreement where they pay somebody else to build the farm, and they pay a certain amount per megawatt hour of energy that comes out of it, or a utility could own it outright. If it's a purchase power agreement, typically those terms, and I'm throwing it out that I don't think they go much longer than 20 years. So when that agreement is over, there's still life left in the solar farm. But there are some components like the inverters, that's the electronic pieces that convert the solar energy from direct current to alternating current to connect it to the grid. They don't last 30 years. They typically last 10, 12, maybe 15 years, but there's a plan to change those out over the life of the solar farm. And so really solar is simple. It's no more complicated than just harvesting energy from the sun. It's converting radiant energy into electric energy. In South Carolina, we have a decent solar resource. It's about 5 full sun hours a day. So if you divide 5 into 24, you get about 20%. And so in the utility industry, you would say it has a 20% generation factor, which is pretty low. But, it's when the sun shines. And one thing that we can say about solar is that it's predictable. I can tell you 1,000 years from now when the sun will not shine. It's forecastable. We've got really good weather forecasting now, so we can predict how much sun there will be in the middle of the day a week from now, or when a front comes in. But the one thing that solar isn't, that utilities are very used to, is you can't call it on demand. You can't say, I need to turn my light on right now. You can't get that from your solar panel. It's there and it collects the energy when it's available, and that is that. And so and I use this term kind of loosely, it's passive generation. And in comparison, this is the John S. Rainey natural gas plant that Santee Cooper owns in the upstate. It is not passive. It has a big natural gas pipe that comes to it. It's got jet engines on the ground that convert that natural gas energy into electric energy when they're attached to generators. And it requires people on site. Coal, that's the Cross Coal Plant in the lower part of the state that's owned by Santee Cooper. It's, the advantage of coal is you can have a big old pile of coal out there and it can be a month's worth of coal. So unlike natural gas, like what happened in Texas when it got really cold and they all of a sudden didn't have enough gas in the pipe to get to the plants and they started having outages, it was really cold and people's demand was really up, their needs were really up, and then they started having failures on the natural gas plant because of there was constraints on the pipeline. Well, the coal plants, you got a pile of coal out there, so that's the advantage of coal. Nuclear, this is the Summer Nuclear Plant number 1. And it also requires people on site, but it's a very long-term site. That plant was built in the early 70s, and they keep extending the life of it. So that plant should be producing probably for another 20 or 30 years yet. The advantage of nuclear that it has over coal and natural gas is it's carbon-free. And when people start paying attention to the carbon that's being produced, nuclear is one of those traditional utility resources that doesn't produce carbon as a process of creating energy. And then even biomass, which is considered a renewable resource. This is the Santee Cooper natural landfill gas site that takes what's normally flamed off in a landfill waste site and puts it through converted diesel generators and creates electricity out of it. So in a way, it's harvesting what would normally be wasted with landfill gas. But solar, when you look at even all those, it's just sitting out in the field, and outside of mowing or whatever's going on there and maintaining it, there isn't a whole lot to it. It's kind of boring in some respects. So a disadvantage of solar, though, is it requires a lot of space and it requires a lot of capacity. Because there's only 5 full sun hours in a day, you got to put more solar panels out there so when the sun is shining, you're collecting more energy. And so I'm going to use, I'm sure you guys have heard of the Summer 2 and 3 nuclear plants and what happened with them. And SCE&G, Santee Cooper, and the electric co-ops all had a piece, either directly or indirectly, of those 2 plants. But the energy that's lost from those 2 plants not being built is equivalent to 10 gigawatts of solar panels. Well, I'm using that G word again. That's 78 square miles of land that would have to be converted to solar panels to create the same energy that would have come out of those nuclear plants. The solar installation I showed at the very beginning, Solar Star, it would require 17 of those. And basically, it's the equivalent of 1/10 of all installed U.S. solar systems to date. So, sometimes until you kind of like start looking at the math, and it's hard to imagine, what does it really mean, one thing replacing another. And so I have a question, and since this is, I'm just talking, I don't need a response, but could you install enough solar panels at your home to meet your annual energy needs? And of course the answer is yes. People install solar all the time. And for the average all-electric home, it's about 10 kilowatts of solar panels, and there's maybe like 35, 36 solar panels there. And those panels, on an average South Carolina all-electric home, would produce the same amount of energy that average home consumes in the course of a year. But there's a problem with that. That solar really needs to be part of the grid, because it's producing energy when you don't need it, and it's not producing energy when you do need it, unless it's connected to something that holds that energy and shifts it or uses it. So one of the very important things that happens when a solar plant gets installed is you have to have a strong enough grid nearby, or it gets expensive building the grid to the solar plant. So a lot of solar plants that are sited get sited near the big power lines, whether very strong distribution lines or the larger transmission lines. And so you guys may have heard this before, but our electric system it's considered one of the largest machines in the world in a way, because it's a balancing act. And it's been that way for 100 years. Utilities provide power when people need it. They usually don't ask a whole lot of questions about how you need it or make you need it at a certain time or not another. And it's really just a just-in-time delivery, because if we don't put enough power into the system when people are consuming, the lights get dim. If we put too much power into the system, more power than the people need, then it causes the voltages to get high and causes other issues. So it's really it's an amazing balancing act that we do. And we have large plants go down all the time, but there's spinning reserves and all kinds of things that happen in the background that keep the grid alive during that. But that's changing, and it's changing in a big way. And I think it's a little bit hard to get our brains around it because the solutions that we had of old aren't necessarily here for us today. And one of these solutions, I think, was asked by Council Feeder, I think, Reader, is that, was what about carbon and greenhouse gases? And, there aren't any greenhouse gas standards in South Carolina or renewable energy standards in South Carolina, but there's definitely a movement afoot, and maybe there will be a national movement too. But the industries, the commercial, and the people that live in their homes are starting to demand renewable energy or carbon-free energy in their home. And so, and some of the ways they're in their home and in the economy. And so, if you look at the numbers, if you electrify the economy, that includes converting all fossil fuel cars into electrified or hydrogen, and hydrogen that's actually created from electricity, the electric load grows by a factor of 2 to 3. And the growth is happening, and people are saying, but no, you can't build another coal plant, or no, you can't build another natural gas plant. So what are you going to do to create the energy that's needed in this conversion that's happening with our economy over the next 15, 20 years? And it's pretty amazing. I mean, you got traditional car companies saying in 10 years, we will not produce another gas or diesel car. Well, people are plugging in at home and at their businesses then to charge. And so this goes to the example that I think somebody asked about, well, what are other countries doing? In one of my advisory roles, I had the opportunity to visit Kauai Island Utility Cooperative. Kauai Island is the 4th largest island of Hawaii, and it's the only island that's run by a co-op. Back in the early 2000s, the investor-owned utility that was there said, you know what, we don't want to do this anymore. And so the state of Hawaii decided at that time, what are we going to do? Are you going to be a cooperative? Are you going to be a municipal? Are you going to be state-owned? And they decided to go the co-op route. So it's a tiny island, and the thing about an island is you're not connected to anybody else. So if you aren't making the energy you need, the lights go out. You have reliability issues. And by the way, they were using a form of diesel for most of their generation. So they were paying, when the prices went up in 2005, 6, and 7, they were paying 45, 50 cents a kilowatt hour at a time that the people in South Carolina were paying 9 cents and 10 cents. And so they decided to say, well, hey, what are we going to do about this? And so they started looking at solar, and their members were putting solar on at the same time, at that time. And so they decided to look at, because the one thing about solar, wind, and landfill gases, for the most part, the fuel is free. It's, it's building the machine that actually harvests it and grabs it. And so on Kauai Island, I visited them in 2014, and I don't know if this thing pointer will work or not. And it kind of disappears on the... But in 2014, they had a lot of rooftop solar, and this is a graph of the renewable generation that's on site. On Kauai Island is a place that has the highest rainfall in the world of like 250 inches of rain in a single day. I mean, in a single year. But yet on the other side of the island, it's like a little desert because the mountain that captures the rain, pulls all the water out of the clouds. And so it's a fascinating place, but they have had hydro for a long time, and that was the first power they had on there. But around 2014, they, in addition to what members were putting on their home, they installed a utility scale project. It had no batteries on it. It was just solar energy. And then in 2016, they put in what they call biomass. And so they have an area of the island they harvest the trees off of, they cut them every so many years, and then they run them and they burn them, and they create biomass out of it. And that's the green line that you see on there. So you see it's pretty steady. Once it's up, it runs probably 90% of the time like the nuclear plant, and it just runs steady all the time. And then you can see on the yellow how it's grown over the years. And so what's remarkable about Kauai Island, when I went there, there was still a belief that you couldn't have but so much renewable energy on your grid without crashing it. Because solar shows up when it shows up, and it goes away when it goes away. And the peak that happens on Kauai Island happens in the evening as the sun sets. So building more solar didn't really help them a whole lot, so they came up with some other solutions. Well, in 2020, 67% of all the energy that was consumed on the island came from renewable energy, 67%. On sunny days, the entire island is run on renewable energy for up to 9 hours. So there's no diesel being burned, none of that. It's just all run by hydro, by the biomass plant, and by solar. And the reliability has gone up because of it. There was a belief that if you have a whole lot of renewable energy on your system, your reliability goes down. But there's certain things that you need to do to actually get it to be higher, and they've actually got the reliability to get higher. Because they used to have a big monster plant that was like a third of what the island needed that ran, and if it tripped off, the whole island went black. And then they'd have to get it back up again. And so one thing that they're doing now is they're still installing solar, but they will never install another utility solar scale project without storage. And so what they do is if they have a 20 megawatt solar site, they install 100 megawatt hours of batteries. And then they engage the batteries in the evening when the system's peaking. It's a little bit more expensive, but it makes it a lot more valuable energy. And this is a Culloden Solar Farm. At the time this was built for Santee Cooper and the cooperatives in 2014, it was the largest site in South Carolina at 3 megawatts. I think it's on 20 acres, but they're not using all of the 20 acres. It's in Walterboro, South Carolina, and if you're driving down 95, you can just catch it. And in fact, you can see 95 in the upper left-hand corner there. There's two kinds of solar panels, and it might be hard to tell, but on the left, they're fixed. So they're facing us, and we are south. And so the sun will rise on your right, and it sets on your left looking at the picture. And then the solar panels on the right are tracking solar panels. And so they're all bent to the right, our right. In the morning, when the sun comes up, they follow. So you can tell by the picture that it must be evening time because you see the shadows cast behind them. And they're a little bit more complicated because they have to move every day to follow the sun, but they create a nicer load curve and they generate a little bit more energy than fixed panels do. But when we had the ice storm in 2014, I think it was, or 15, they got locked up because ice got in the system and locked it up, and it had to get fixed. And that's all I have.
All right, thanks, Michael. Members of council, questions?
One of the things that did come to mind, it was brought up briefly in the earlier presentation, was severe weather conditions. Obviously, engineering-wise, these things have to be stable. They have to protect not only against hail, but you could have tornadoes. I mean, we're subject in this area to having a tornado. That has to be part of the design requirements. Are there standard design requirements for tornadoes and earthquake, seismic type events that these solar farms are built to?
There are. I can't speak to the specific standard. I know the ones that are typically built out on the coast have to withstand a hurricane in a way that the one that's built inland doesn't. And they have to be mounted a certain way too. It's a risk. I mean, there are no promises. If a tornado has a direct hit, it will do damage. In the same way as if there is a significant seismic activity. The nice thing about solar, though, and this is kind of what we felt a little bit with Summer Nuclear 2 and 3, we invested, the utilities invested $10 billion or so, but it was kind of all or nothing. Either you finished the plant or you didn't. The nice thing about solar is you can kind of stop halfway through and you still have something. You can have part of it damaged and you can segregate it off, and you can still use the other part of the plant to get your energy from.
Other questions for
The
Mark?
only, we would not need batteries because it's going to the grid, is what I understand on this project.
So when you just have a little bit of solar, and for the most part, we have just a little bit of solar on our system in South Carolina, even though it's growing. You know, we're not like a Hawaii, or we're not like a California or a Germany that has a high solar penetration. So we can get away with putting in some of this generation that happens as it happens and not have energy storage. But I promise you that there's something when the sun is shining bright in the springtime, because really the springtime is when solar panels do their best. It's cooler outside, the electronics like the cooler, they convert energy better, and they tend to face in a way that is maximized for the springtime. There is a fossil fuel plant someplace that's backing off a little bit to account for that. And so it becomes part of what's balanced. And what's interesting is our utility system, you know, in the old days, is you had load happen and the utility generated to the load. Now you're starting to have generation happen with wind and solar, and the utility and the people that are on the utility system are looking like, how can we make the load, how can we start shaping the load to the available energy that's coming? And electric vehicles, I think, are the perfect example of that, because if I have an electric vehicle, I almost don't care when it charges. I mean, when it's charged, just as long as when I leave, it's as much energy in the car as I want it to. It's not like cooking dinner where you can't just postpone your oven running. And so our utility is becoming a lot more complex, but in the process, it's becoming more resilient. But batteries are expensive, and until purchase power agreements, until the utility recognizes South Carolina is vertically integrated. You know, we don't have a regional transmission organization or an independent system operator like you do have up north, where I can generate and I can sell it to anybody who's willing to buy it at a certain price. Here you're kind of captured, and so whoever's power lines are going through, you're kind of captured to connecting to them and getting an agreement with them. And I think that's why solar hasn't necessarily taken off quite as much in South Carolina as it has in others. But it's more expensive to add batteries. There's more value to us if it's used accordingly. But if you got $10 million to spend and you're getting paid for the energy, you'd probably spend it making more energy instead of moving it to another time. But at a certain level, you will want to build batteries or have some other thing that's balancing that solar generation.
I guess asking, of course, current national administration is pushing green energy probably more than it's been pushed in the past 20 years. And I guess the reason it's being pushed, though, is because it is supposedly better for the environment. I guess this has minimal impact on the environment as a whole, except at the decommissioning stage, and then that is supposed to be, I guess, pretty controlled. Am I correct on that?
That's for the agreements that, you know, of whoever's building it, and then whatever DHEC comes up with. DHEC had a meeting. Stacy mentioned that they have this process, stakeholder process right now. And I was on a call, their first call last week, and y'all can participate too. There was cities that were on the call, and anybody who's interested in what happens to the solar panels at the end of life can weigh in about their concerns, and DHEC is supposed to address those concerns. This was an interesting comment by DHEC. Your couch, when it's in your house, is a piece of furniture. They could care less about it, except when it goes to the curb, and then it's solid waste. Now they get involved. This is one of the very few instances, if the first instances, where they're involved on the front end, even before it comes to become solid waste. And that's important because I think it gives us direction about what to expect at the end, because I'm sure we've all had bad experiences with something not being dealt with accordingly at the end of life.
That's kind of why the end of life you can project and predict and plan for. And that's why I did ask the question about tornadoes, seismic events, because they shorten the life unexpectedly. Mm-hmm. And then you have to deal with waste on a more urgent timeline. That's why I asked, were there some standard specifications in place that at least, you may not make it totally tornado-proof or earthquake-proof up to 7 on the Richter scale, but are the ones that you know that have been built, are they built to specifications, the structural specifications to withstand expected tornadoes?
I can't answer that. I don't have that knowledge specifically on how it's built. I just can't imagine anything surviving a tornado, even a small tornado, without getting some damage.
Some damage is kind of relevant.
Yeah. Well, but to
Versus,
Tracy's point, they do
taking,
test for hail, because hail does happen. It is common enough, and it's catastrophic when
Right.
it does. And so the glass that's used is pretty amazing and resistant, but it too has its limits about what it can take.
I just wondered if there were some kind of standard specifications to protect that.
I can find that answer for you, at least the industry standard for that points to it.
That would be good to know as far as when it comes to requirements, specifications.
Do you think that solar is going to eventually become the standard? And if so, how long?
So if I just needed energy today, I don't think it can be built cheaper than building a solar plant. I don't think you can build a natural gas plant. You definitely won't go to coal. Coal has all kinds of things attached to it now, and it's gotten expensive. And speaking to going to a new standard, a few years ago, the standards were relaxed for coal, but utilities didn't go back to it for the most part. For one thing, natural gas was cheaper, and there's a lot of uncertainty around coal and carbon. And so I know sometimes it feels like you're whipsawed, but industry loves certainty. What can I count on? Like, if I'm gonna build a solar plant, how many years do I get this amount of money per megawatt hour of energy that's produced? And if you're only promising that for 5 years or 10 years, that's not long enough. I'm not gonna build that plant. And so, we all like as much certainty as we can. And I think one thing that's pretty certain is renewable energy or carbon-free energy is about as risk-free as far as laws being passed, carbon taxes being passed, and so on. But it has its costs too. Square miles of land is a lot. You're converting land from one function to another function. One of the things I focus on is energy efficiency, and really the best thing you can do is not need the kilowatt hour, and then it has the lowest risk on everything else. And so making our homes more efficient with more efficient equipment, sealing them up, insulating them, it lowers your electric bill, and it keeps us from having to build more plant. That is like the least risk thing that we can do. But the industry's changing. I was listening to so in school I'm working on electric vehicle charging, managed charging, and so on. The fleet operator for FedEx Express, they operate the planes, they operate everything but what normally comes to your house. By 2025, half of their light-duty and medium-duty vehicle purchases will be electric, and by 2030, 100% of their vehicles will be purchased. Now, is it because they're going green? Well, going green was a start, but they kind of figured out by looking at electric vehicles over the last 10 years, they're not worried about the battery technology catching up. There's a lot of people working on it. The batteries are going to get better and smarter and smaller and less expensive. Having an electric vehicle is just cheaper to operate. It's like the right answer if you just want to lower your maintenance costs, if you want to lower your fuel costs. But one of those plants coming on a utility is a huge load, and it may require a substation to be built. Well, that's a problem if it needs to be done in a year. And so there's a lot of things that are happening right now that it will look very different 5 years from now. But solar's not going away. Of the renewable, of the carbon-free energy sources we have, nuclear, we're not touching that in South Carolina until somebody else proves it, that it works. Wind, there's 7 wind turbines offshore in the U.S. right now. Where U.S. is a little bit slow. We've got a pretty good resource off Myrtle Beach, but that's going to be a long time before we have enough wind turbines put out there and to get that sited. And landfill gas, biogas solar is really the only go-to that we have if somebody says, I need you to create energy and I need it to be carbon-free in the next 3 or 4 years. We don't have many options.
Mr. Smith, this doesn't really impact the decisions we'll be making, but I just have a question. We know technology improves at just rapid rate. Solar panels themselves, the efficiency has improved in that technology in the last few years. Do you see on the horizon as there work on improving the solar cell technology to the point that it would take less land, or conversely, you could produce more power on the same land of the solar cells that you would have now? Is that technology kind of on the horizon? Do you see
Yes.
that kind of improvement in efficiency?
So if you double the efficiency, then you need half the land. And so the 78 square miles turns into 39 square miles for those 2 nuclear plants, which is huge. And that is possible, and they're working towards that. But when somebody builds a solar plant, and this is they kind of want a guarantee, and they want something proven. So some of the solar plants that are being built now don't have the newest technology because it doesn't have a long track record yet. And I can verify this. We had the company I worked for got an electric car converted 13 years ago. It was cutting edge, and the thing caught fire. And it's like, okay, it proved, it works, that you can plug in the wall and drive on it, but it was a good pilot program, but you want something that's kind of proven and that's built. And so the improvements in solar cell efficiency are probably going to be more utilized on buildings where you only have a fixed roof space. But if you have a lot of land and you want something that's manufactured and is proven, it'll probably be a little less efficient right now until land either gets very expensive or you're constrained in some way or another.
Other questions for Mr. Smith?
Once the solar farm gets established, the adjacent lands will be any more rezoning to them? Will there be any more rezoning connecting the lines to the solar farm?
You mean from the utility?
Yes.
Normally, and I don't know, I don't know of a specific site that you're speaking to, but normally when somebody sites a solar site, there's power lines right there because it reduces one of the biggest costs of connecting solar to the grid, and that's having to get easements for more power lines, especially if they're big power lines. And so typically they're there already. But you kind of have to look at a specific site to see. Like the Colleton Solar Farm I showed up there, that's on Coastal Electric Cooperative's distribution line. So it's below the substation, and there's houses that are attached to the same lines and businesses right off of 95. All they did is they used the same easements, and they just put in bigger wire because of the size of that solar farm. But usually, developers avoid having to require building more power lines. But if they do, then there's a process for that to go through. When a utility installs large power lines, there's a process for blindly deciding which way it goes, and then what land you have to get easements over. And I'll speak to this too on the use of the land. A lot of the wide power lines, you've seen the big transmission lines, There's a couple ways you can maintain the grass there and the trees. You can cut them down, you can spray a bunch of herbicide and kill the plants. But one of the things that the utilities have been involved with is the monarch butterfly was up to be put on the endangered species, and its population has really dwindled. One of the things that would help them is put the pollinator plants in the right-of-way section, and if you don't cut it at certain times, it really helps the butterflies as they're moving from Mexico up into the Northeast, because we do have a lot of them pass through South Carolina, and they need that food along the way. And so it's not a bad use of right-of-way or solar farms to thoughtfully put in things like pollinator species that add something to, something that's missing already.
So it's a possibility that once we approve the solar farm, the landowner will have to be rezoned or get them a right of way for the line connecting?
Possibly for the right-of-way. The rezoning, I have no idea about. I guess that's y'all's,
Case basis, probably.
y'all's decision on how land is used here.
I'm probably guessing, and again, strictly a guess, but I'm sure that they would, before they would approve a site, they would have a way of transmitting the power to, I don't think we would approve the site and then they would go out and condemn or take over land. I'm sure the site's probably pretty much gonna be connected before they even talk about putting a solar farm into place.
Yeah, I would say so too. And like I say, it just makes sense to pick land that's as close as it can be set up to being a good solar farm.
And I will say this, and I think this probably stands still constant for this council. I know with previous councils, there has been very little motivation to do condemnation for basically anything. And I seriously doubt this council would be any different on condemnation.
Yeah.
All right, other questions? Michael, thanks a lot for your
Thank you for your
input,
time.
your knowledge, expertise, and all those other things.
All right, thank you.
Rick, that's all the speakers we have, right?
Yes, sir.
All right, at this time, we've got public comments by those signed up. We've got 5 people that have signed up. Typically, we allow roughly 3 minutes for public speaking. Due to this one, if everybody's on council's okay, let's go 5. Would y'all be okay with that? Make sure everybody has a chance to have their piece. All right, so with the first one would be Mr. Bill Parr. If you state your name and address, we appreciate it.
It's an honor to come before Newberry County Council to talk about one of my passionate things, and that's solar power. My name is Bill Parr. I live 2.5 miles due west of here at 914 Belfast Road. And my wife and I invested in residential solar at our house 2.5 years ago. And it's really exceeded our expectations. We have 36 panels. They're in our front yard. They point due south. And the only maintenance we've done on them in 2.5 years is after the yellow cloud of pollen, pine pollen, moves through in late March, early April. We go out there and she has a water hose and I have the brush, and we try to wipe some of that sticky pollen off the panels. Our break-even cost on this investment was originally between 8 and 9 years, and that's with the price of electricity remaining static. And I think there's a highly likely chance that that's not going to be the case. So I think it's probably the best investment that I've made since I built my house 26 years ago. The panels have a warranty. Are you ready for this? 25 years. The panels are guaranteed by the manufacturer to produce 85% of their rated power for 25 years. The most amazing thing about it to me is there's no moving parts. There's no bearings. There's no steam. What's the source of power? It's the sun. God gives it to us. A utility doesn't own it. We own it as the property owners. So obviously, I'm very passionate about this. I would think that we're going to see a lot of this in the future. And appreciate the opportunity to speak to Newberry County Council. I'll address any questions you may have.
All right, questions for Bill?
I
Thank you.
For coming forward as a positive person about it.
I would invite you, Mary, to come out, and I'd love to show it to you. We also have batteries as well. And so we're on the co-op, and it's been nice working with the co-op. I think the whole paradigm for electrical distribution is changing. The utilities obviously have a monopoly, and it's a monopoly by law. And with this new technology and the ever-decreasing price of solar panels, I think we're going to see a widespread adoption of solar energy in our lifetime. And so there's a revolution going on. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Mac Flores.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. Mr. Farmer, I appreciate you putting this meeting together and bringing in these experts. Sorry, my name is Mac Flores. I'm here representing Ecoplexus. I have had the opportunity to speak with some of you before this, but I don't want to take up too much time. I think our experts did a great job of explaining solar. What I want to do is take this time to hand out my card to each and every one of you. Please let me know if any of your constituents have any questions or concerns. My job is to help ease those questions for you. So please feel free to give them my phone number, my email, take a picture of the card, send it right to them. I'd love to speak to any of your constituents with questions. So I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, sir.
All right, Chris Sandifer.
Chairman, my apologies. Chris Sandifer was not able to make it today.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
So far, we could have cut it to less than 3 minutes, but okay. Okay, James Floyd?
My name is James Floyd, otherwise known as Jim Floyd. I live at 1520 Boundary Street in Newberry, but we own property on Island Ford Road, which is immediately adjacent to the solar panel in question, where the solar panel is on the river, and I'm right across the river from the subject property we're talking about. We're not talking about solar panels in a home or something. We're talking about, I think it's 485 acres. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a very huge project. I have a lot of environmental concerns. The thing being on the river, it's in the watershed of the Little River. Little River, when it runs into the Little River, probably it's less than a mile from the water plant, the Newberry water plant. And I don't know what the environmental impact will be on the water supply. Secondly, I have concerns. Well, what's the financial stability of this company? We've heard that the life of the disposal of the panels causes some environmental concern. Well, how do we know this company is stable enough to perform its obligations? Has anybody looked at the financial statements, the financial ability, the power purchase agreement? What happens if the power purchase agreement is a short life? Then I assume Duke Power, because this runs by Duke Power. plant, I assume the electricity will go to do power. Well, you know, basically what happens if it, after the end of the agreement. With regard to the size, I think a lot of you guys probably have gone toward Augusta and Saluda County. This is a solar farm. I think it's 50 acres. Well, okay, 50 acres is huge. But looking at over 450 acres, this thing is 9 times bigger. Take a very close look at the impact this thing may have. And I guess my time's probably run out. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, appreciate your comments. Okay, next we have Mr. Carl Bremer.
Thank y'all for hearing me again, and I was pleased to hear the speakers tonight. I'm going to tell you what I heard, okay? What I heard from the speakers tonight was that, yeah, decommission can be a problem. And then I heard, well, what is the plan? Well, we don't really know what the plan is. The DHEC's working on that, and they're going to have one, but we don't know what it is. But they admitted, it's got cadmium in it. We all know from our last meeting that that's carcinogenic. We all know that it's right next to a river. And I think that Mr. Floyd stated it best, okay? Mr. Floyd says that this is a huge facility. It's better than 400 acres, okay? Let's say that 1% of that 400 acres is damaged every year by a storm or some other calamity or just natural deterioration. That's 4.5 acres. And then Mr. Hipp brought up a very good point where these things don't leach. The answer that you got was they don't leach while they in their main integrity. What happens when they fractured? Water runs down through them, it runs into the soil, it gets in, and it migrates right down to the river, okay? You know, all this is nice and good, and I understand the county wants the money. Everybody wants the money, but here's the problem. Somebody's going to have to pay the piper at the end. I brought this up last time, and I felt like I got kind of brushed off, but what was brought up was Mr. Flores stood up here and gave each and every one of you a card, and it says Ecoplexus. Ecoplexus is not the one that's asking for this. It is another LLC that they have opened up. It is not Ecoplexus. Ecoplexus has distanced themselves from this particular scenario. Why is that? The logical answer is the reason they have is to shield themselves from any exposure for long-term liability. Because whenever it comes time to decommission, or when you have that 1% failure rate, if they only had a 1% failure rate, I'd be surprised. But when they have that 1% failure rate every year, you got 4.5 acres of those panels leaching into the soil, into the river, and you got a problem. And then you say, well, let's go to DHEC. Well, you know, we don't have a plan for how to resolve that, okay? Here's going to end up who's going to have to resolve it, the county or the state of South Carolina. It won't be Ecoplexus. It won't be the LLC that's making this petition. Okay. But the real people that's going to be hurt is me and my family and the adjoining landowners, because we are going to be having exposed to that stuff. Once it gets into soil, there's no way to stop it. There's no way to remediate it. And they say, well, you know, we filed a $50,000 bond, or we're going to give you a $50,000 bond. $50,000 wouldn't buy the diesel fuel to remediate this site, much less pay for the labor or the specialized. You look at the cost of remediating a hazardous material, and this is not my word. This is the word that Miss Washington used. She characterized this as hazardous material. Hazardous material. Without a plan, the state doesn't have a plan, an approved plan for decommissioning. I want y'all to think about all that, because what it means is, if you approve it, you're adopting the installation of potentially hazardous material that has carcinogenic in it, that doesn't have a guarantee against failure, that a 1% failure rate is going to be 4.5 acres of contamination at a minimum, and 1% is an extraordinarily conservative number in my assessment, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And there's no plan. And the people that you gave that permission to aren't the ones, they aren't Ecoplexus. There's some little LLC that Ecoplexus has formed. So you're not even going to have a way to reach back to get them, to make them pay for it. Ecoplexus is not the one that is making this claim. That should cause you a lot of suspicion. It causes me a lot of suspicion. Now, I respect Mr. Parr, okay? I think he's a great guy. I think he's a smart guy. But he is not on the same scale as what you're proposing. His potential failure is minuscule, okay? Theirs is catastrophic, and the risk is too great. You have not heard anybody. The largest one that Mr. Smith, and I was making notes, was in the state of South Carolina, 20 some odd acres. They want 450 plus acres. The potential for failure is too high, the cost is too high, and the people that you're dealing with are not who they're representing they are. It is my plea to you to turn this down. You have not heard one word tonight that a solar farm was a financially fiscal smart move. You've not heard one word that they generate more than they cost. And I submit to you that the only reason that you're getting this petition is that Ecoplexus wants to make a sale, and it's going to be at my expense. And I ask that you deny it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brummer. All right, that's all that we have signed up.
Is it possible that I could speak for 3 minutes?
Sir?
I know this Taylor.
Yeah, but you didn't sign up,
I
did you?
didn't sign up.
Okay, you'll have to come to the next council meeting and ask to speak at that time, please, sir.
Thank you.
All right, we've heard the people that have spoken tonight. We've got a lot of people we appreciate.
Mr. Chairman, in all fairness, even in our regular sessions, sometimes we have people that haven't signed up but have a real interest in the subject, and we have allowed people to speak. Now, we have the actual landowner here tonight that's the land in question, and we're at a work session. I think this would be unfair to not allow Mr. Taylor to speak. I mean, he can have a few minutes.
What are the wishes of council?
I'd like to hear what he's got to say, to be honest with you.
All right, y'all okay? All right, you got 3 minutes, my friend. Or close thereabout. I won't hold you to that about a second.
Thank you for allowing me to speak. I want to address a couple of things that were said here, and it's nothing about the advantages of this solar farm, but you know what the advantages are. I want to talk about the risk of this solar farm, because we just heard a lot of things that I think were really accurate. First of all, as the landowner, we are not selling the land. We are renting the land. So that makes a great deal of difference. So that means that the county really doesn't have any risk in this. Who is bearing the risk is the landowner. And what risk are we bearing? By far, the biggest risk we are bearing is that Duke Power goes bankrupt, or that Duke Power says that they don't want to buy the electricity. Now let's look at that. The odds of Duke Power going bankrupt, they're an $82 billion company, is very, very remote. The likelihood that they won't buy the electricity is again very, very low because they need that electricity. Duke Power cannot build another Lake Greenwood. Duke Power cannot build another nuclear plant. And when you think of the future of the electric cars, if Duke Power doesn't get the electricity from Newberry County, what's going to happen? They're going to get it from Saluda County, Lawrence County, Union County, Fairfield County. They're going to get the electricity. I want to talk about the bankruptcy because that was brought up, that Echoplex doesn't own the thing and they've got an agent that has it. I mean, we've done this for years, building shopping centers where you have an LLC that comes in and owns this particular entity. I want to talk about what happens. Let's say Echoplex does go bankrupt. Let's say the company that they've picked to run it goes bankrupt. What happens? We are not a communistic country. We are a free enterprise system. We have bankrupt laws. And what would happen if they go bankrupt, you go in front of a bankrupt court, a bankrupt judge will decide, the electricity will still flow to Duke, and the judge will decide how they pay it out. So bankruptcy on this is simply not a good thing. And let me say something else. This was brought up that the bond was only $50,000, that's nothing. But this is what we have thought through. I mean, that's what I've done for 50 years, try to manage risk. And it is risk. We are taking on some risk. But this is what we have already decided to do. Before the first panel is installed, we're going to have $500,000 in escrow, just in case. And you might say, just in case for what? That's what it's there for, just in case something comes up that we didn't think about. So thank you very much for the right to speak.
Thank you. All right, folks, we've heard a lot of information tonight. I hope that it's kind of, I guess, been of value to us. So with that, we'll go comments or requests from council members, and I'll start with Nick.
I appreciate all the expert speakers. It's a lot of information to think about. Mr. Taylor, Mr. Brummerford, thank y'all for speaking up. Gave us a lot to think about.
Mr. Hill?
Yes, also thank you for our professional input, our non-biased input to help us in fact-finding. Thank you for the biased input, for those that have desires both for or opposed to this. We've also got some additional information for those that are here or who may be watching online. We've got additional information. Many years ago, we put into place in our ordinance a requirement to have decommissioning as cost covered through bonds. And we also have examples of other counties here who have solar farms or who are in the process of solar farms. And so we've got some good examples to go home and study to give us an idea of how other counties protect the landowner, protect themselves. And I don't think there's any question about, based on information that we have, that from a tax base return, this will provide considerable more tax base return than what agricultural property would be. And my final comment is I have toured this property. I didn't just look at a map. I went through the property. I saw where the local, the nearest local resident was. I looked at the property and I thought to myself, its location, that if we shut the door on this, we need to think carefully. But if we close the door on this solar project, we have just about closed the door in Newberry County to solar projects, just based on what I've seen, that, you know, we could just about put a no vacancy sign out front when it comes to solar in Newberry County. But I think we all have a lot to study and learn and make our decisions based on facts and not emotions.
All right, Mary?
Yeah, I want to thank Ms. Washington and Mr. Smith for their professional presentations. It's a lot of data. So I thank y'all, and I thank Rick for finding unbiased information for us. One of the things that pops out to me, we have a buffer that's gonna be around this too, and a lot of the solar farms I've seen, you just ride down the highway, you can see them. You won't even know this one's here unless you fly in an airplane. So I like that about part of our zoning and that we've got in place already. I'm anxious to see what DHEC comes up with. But we've got a lot of good information here, and I just want to thank y'all for it.
All right, Mr. Scurry?
We thank everyone for the information, and we're gonna study it. But I don't want to put money to be able to find the answers, so we want to get the money. I want to say we want to get what Newberry County needs. And to the landowner, I have searched that area all my life. I have rode back near Newberry County cars, sheriff department, running cows from side to side. I was exactly all that land back in there. You know, the old house back in there, the river back in there, I knew all of what it is. I also have some land back in there also. Well, I don't want to just say the money our basic issue. I want to say that it's not for the land, but it's for what's best for Newberry County. Study some more that we're gonna do, and we do want to make good decisions for what's best for Newberry County. I'm acting council. Don't look at the negative or the positive. Look at what's best for Newberry County, and I beg us to go forward on what's best for the county. Thank you.
Mr. Reader?
I want to thank Mr. Farmer for putting all this together. Thank my experts for coming up and answering all the necessary questions that council has brought forth. I also want to thank all the public who came up and gave their opinion, because if you don't give your opinion, we don't know where you stand. So I appreciate this taking place, because it has really opened my eyes and answered some questions that I previously had. Thank you.
Well, again, thanks to the same people. Rick, thanks for putting the team together. Thanks to the professional opinions. One of the things I would like to ask Mr. Smith, if you possibly could, or Dr. Smith, 525,000 acres, I think, are currently in solar farms, according to the paper that you put out. If there's a way that you could potentially look and see what kinds of problems have occurred within those 525 acres that would be, 525,000 acres that would be so-called catastrophic.
Okay.
And again, I don't know whether that's easy to be found or not, but it's just something based on some comments about 1/4 of a whatever. It just would be interesting to know if there have been catastrophic problems and how they were handled,
Yes, sir.
and
Yes,
what kind of implications they had on the community in which they were in.
I'll see what I can find out. one thing I do know is usually when there's a company that owns the panels and a company that's buying, whatever problems there are, they like to fix it quickly so they can get the money going again. But, you know, if it takes out, something that takes out a whole site, I'll look into it, and, you know, if it's out there, it should be easy enough to find.
Right, thank you. And again, if it happens, if you can get it, that's great. If not, I understand. With that being said, I do appreciate everybody that came out tonight. Obviously, if you're here tonight, you do have a vested interest in what's going on in Newberry County or what's going on with this particular project, so we do appreciate you being here. Mr. Taylor, no disrespect for not originally allowing you to speak, but proper protocol with the meeting is not to if you hadn't signed up. So in the future, for anybody out there, what's that, if when in doubt, just turn around and go out and sign up, so when it comes time to speak, we can do that without problem. Also, just like to say thanks to the council members who are all up here trying to figure out what is best for Newberry County. It's not an easy task sitting here always, sometimes making very difficult decisions. So again, thank you to the co-council members. We do have a lot of information that we can continue to study, and we are open. I think everybody's pretty open-minded on this because I think we're totally uncertain as it all goes along. So with that being said, we are welcoming any additional information and any guidance that we can get to help us make the best decision for our county. With that being said, do I have a motion to adjourn? Motion by Nick. All right, we are adjourned. Les.
Well, we have done it now.
Any other meetings? No, and yeah.
And the person said, and he is the landowner.
I appreciate it.